Welcome to the Premier League Proven Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff, with my co-host and brother, Kevin, and today we are doing a requested episode, which is all about West Ham United Football Club. This is another London team that I think has a pretty big footprint in terms of what people think of in terms of soccer. I think part of that is they have a really distinctive kit. They have a great name. West Ham just kind of sounds a little bit ridiculous. They were, of course, one of the key teams in Green Street Hooligans. So West Ham United, this is a team that you can kind of put it alongside Everton, Aston Villa, as outside of those top 7 teams. This is kind of the next class in terms of the size of club. West Ham United is a famous club, a lot of fans. It's a powerful, being in London just gives them a little bit more oomph and a little bit more power. And it's a team that initially was founded, and this has gone all the way through the club, by an ironworks group. Basically all the teams back then were founded by a bunch of guys, tended to be working on a job. They said, let's go form a soccer team. And around the late 1800s, Thames Ironworks FC was founded from the workers of the Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Company. So this has been a team that's always kind of had riveting and shipbuilding and ironworking throughout their history, and that's reflected in their crest and what they call themselves. So the biggest thing that you might hear West Ham call themselves is they always call themselves massive. And massive is a huge term and a funny term in England. I don't think we really use it quite as much in the U.S., but it's kind of one of the funnier things that pretty much West Ham fans say after every small victory. They just, call themselves massive, and it's a good time for everyone. And they make a little X with their hands that kind of represents the ironworking rivet hammers that are on their crest as well. And West Ham United, big team, and a team I think that thinks that they can maybe push to that next level.
Yeah, they're coming off a really, really successful season. I think the last couple of years as well, they've kind of been finishing actually pretty high up in the table. But yeah, last year they ended up winning the Conference League. So this is the third tier of European competition every year. But to them, this was huge, right? This is a European trophy. So they're really coming off the high of that last year.
And you have to think, West Ham United they're a team that has not won a ton. I guess there's a famous episode called the White Horse Final, I think in the 1920s, when they basically trotted out this white horse. One of the players rode it onto the field, and 200,000 people watched the game. And this giant white horse was, kind of walking onto the field with everyone in the crowd, kind of celebrating it like some, like Return of the King or something like that. We will ignore the fact that West Ham lost that match to Bolton. It was still the White Horse Final sounds pretty funny. But yeah, I mean, this is a team that has not had a ton of success. So that success last year was really important. The most famous event for West Ham is they won the 1964 FA Cup, but England has only won the World Cup how many times? 1 time, which, for the team that's invented soccer, not so great. They probably feel it's a little embarrassing now that they turned up their noses at the first few World Cups because they thought, they were too good for it and that it was kind of beneath them. But when England won in 1966, the captain of England was Bobby Moore. I believe he was the captain, but he was also the captain of West Ham. And Martin Peters was the guy who scored in the final, and Geoff Hurst was the first guy to score a hat trick in a World Cup final. All of those players are West Ham youth team graduates, and the fact that they basically formed a big part of the core of the England's only World Cup winning team is a huge source of pride and a huge source of kind of glory for West Ham United. And since then, it's been challenging, and that's why I think we find ourselves in this moment where they did win a trophy for the first time, and that was just so monumental for the fans last year. But it's also, there's still a lot of fans, I think, questioning where they're at and what the future is going to look like.
Yeah, it's a classic debate here of, do you want to watch good soccer, entertaining soccer, or do you just want results? And I think that's kind of the predicament that West Ham is in right now. And David Moyes, who's their manager, spent a lot of time at Everton, some time at United, and it's
He's a fixture in the Premier League really since like 2000. But just briefly, that the fans, when you're winning stuff, then the fans want to see basically more beautiful soccer being played. And when you're not winning anything, then they say, I don't care about the soccer, I just want to win stuff. But as soon as you start winning stuff, then they say, oh well, now I want it to look pretty too.
it's a really good point, and I think one of the things Spurs kind of have gone through without winning either of it. Well, I will sell my soul to win something, and then once you've sold your soul and won something, you're like, well, I want it back. So I think it's really an interesting time right now where it's a big debate of Moyes or not Moyes, right? Is he the future of the club? Is he going to kind of take them into this next level and kind of keep them there and kind of hopefully be able to break in to consistently be getting European positions? Or are they looking for someone to kind of take them on a new direction with a new manager? And it's interesting because they qualified. I think they won their group actually in Europa League, which is the second tier of European competition. They're actually not doing too bad this year, but still interesting to see some fans saying, you know what, I think we might need a change of direction.
Yeah, and when you said Tamoys or not, Tamoys, I really wanted you to do it in kind of an Elizabethan Hamlet type accent here.
It's for our Patreon subscribers only.
We'll let you work on that.
We do the whole episode in ASMR.
Tamoys or not Tamoys, but that's my poor effort. But I think it, like you said, it does get into the fundamental kind of aspects of what it means to be a fan and supporter. But when you have this little bit of success, it's hard to sustain it. And David Moyes, admittedly, and I know this as a Manchester United fan, is not an inspiring character, right? Like he's just kind of a classic workhorse, just grinds the team with a hardworking, defensive first, physical, set piece, let's win scrappy type of team that's never really going to like make this a memorable team or a team that, you're always going to be remember for the rest of your life or anything like that. And I think West Ham, I think the fans have always viewed themselves as kind of an attacking club too, which we've talked about in different series where different clubs have kind of a different ethos. And West Ham has always had an incredible youth academy. They've always brought through really good players. Recently Declan Rice is probably the biggest example, but players like Frank Lampard played here, Rio Ferdinand, Michael Carrick, I believe. Basically in the mid-2000s or so, they came out with a ton of the youth products that a lot of them ended up in the English national team. So I think the West Ham fans kind of imagine and dream for kind of a greater future. It's going to be hard in the current Premier League era. And so it's hard to just tell fans to kind of just stop dreaming and just be happy with how far you've come. Right? Because that's not really why you're in it. You always want to see your club kind of move up, but you do have to be careful when you try to go for those home runs. You're more likely to strike out and get relegated and move your team to the bottom of the table. But West Ham, in the last decade, their move from their historic ground, the Boylan Ground, has really tried to precipitate, and I think from their perspective, has given them a platform to potentially, in the next 30 years, really rise up in terms of how big the club is commercially.
Yeah, I completely agree. I just want to go back on one thing. I think a lot of this frustration for fans, where it's coming from, is they think that West Ham has the best team they've had in a decade or more. And so that's what they're a little bit upset about, is just don't know if Moyes is, he's obviously getting a lot out of them, but maybe not getting everything that could be gotten out of actually a pretty talented team. But that is a really great point. West Ham is now playing at the London Stadium. So I think this was a stadium that was built for the Olympics. So I think it was like the 2012 Olympics were in London. And West Ham more or less has a really cheap deal. As we all know, Spurs spending over £1 billion. I think Everton is spending 700 million on their new stadiums. Building stadiums is expensive. And so West Ham said, hey, you know what? Let's try to they kind of worked with London and said, hey, let's see how much we can get this stadium for. So they're more or less paying 15 million potentially for the stadium. They're actually renting it right now for about 2.5 million a year, which is nothing. compared to, what a stadium costs. And so there's talk about them being able to actually purchase the stadium as a whole and to be able to own it. But it's a huge stadium. The only downside to it is, as you can probably guess, it was built for the Olympics.
People call it soulless.
Yeah, that would be an understatement. It's built for the Olympics, so there is a giant track around it. And so what that does is that pushes the fans off of the field, right? It kind of pushes everybody out. At times, depending on where you are in that oval, 20 yards away from the touchline, and it really kind of kills the atmosphere.
You never want to take stadium ideas from the Italian teams.
No, you do not. And so it really, soulless is the right word for it. I think, for example, I went to a Spurs game at Wembley when they were building their new stadium, and it just felt soulless, right? It just feels wrong. It's just hard to have historic stands that I've gone to all these games with the same people to my left and right. We know all the songs here to these stadiums that weren't necessarily designed for our team, and you really do lose a lot of atmosphere. So, of course, they are getting a sweet deal, and I'm sure it's helping their financials, and I'm sure it's helping them buy better players. But it probably kind of sucks if you're a fan going to games all the time.
Yeah, and you run into these issues with these historic stadiums, where the historic stadiums usually most clubs probably want to move out of their part. At least part of them says they want to move out of the stadiums that they've been in for 100 years because they don't have they weren't designed with box seats in mind, right? They weren't designed to literally like scrape milk the entire fan base for every single penny it's worth, right? So it doesn't have a ton of.
See, now teams are taking the American model, which is definitely not for the fans and for the best interest of the fans.
Yeah, they want to sell more premium tickets. They want to sell more premium experiences. They want to have boxes. They want to have bars. They want to have all this kind of stuff that, makes them more money than just selling another 35-pound ticket to a game. And it does allow them to have, more people, because a lot of those, the old stadiums outside of places like Old Trafford and things aren't built for that many people, 30, 40,000 people, which as the Premier League becomes kind of a global superpower league, there's more and more eyeballs on all of these games. And so the demand for games probably does go up. And so there's probably room for more fans and they will get more money from that. But I think you are always in a competition with, if Manchester United wanted to tear down Old Trafford, which they might, if Chelsea wants to tear down Stamford Bridge, if Liverpool wants to get rid of Anfield, what are they going to replace them with? And are they going to lose a lot of the atmosphere? And I think in the case of West Ham, their old ground had a ton of atmosphere, and they definitely lost something in terms of atmosphere, like you said, with the new stadium. But the new stadium does unlock some doors from a club success and club financials perspective that, depending on what your kind of goals are as a fan, may be worth it in the long run.
Yeah, probably good for foreign fans or, fans that aren't going to games a lot. Bad for fans that are going to the games all the time. But I think something you mentioned already, and something that needs to be mentioned more and more, is how well West Ham have actually coped with selling Declan Rice. I mean, of course, they weren't giving him away for free by any means. They got a cool 100 million for him. But I've actually been really impressed with how well they've still held their midfield together. And I think getting James Ward-Prowse from Southampton, Southampton got relegated last year. I think it was a great move. Personally, I love watching James Ward-Prowse play. He is a dead ball specialist.
He's kind of like a budget David Beckham, and I mean that in a good way, because David Beckham was, one of the best players in the world for a while.
Yeah, but the guy is unreal at free kicks, unreal. Whether they're on target or putting in crosses, he adds a dimension to the game, in a really, really good way. And really, if you're playing kind of counterattacking style, if you're kind of playing, sitting a little bit deep and not potentially having as many scoring opportunities, having a dead ball specialist is a huge, huge deal. That helps your chances, right? If you're playing counterattacking, you may only get 3, 4, 5 real good chances all day, and 1 or 2 of them might be from a dead ball. So having a guy like that really ups your odds, really helps you out if you're kind of playing and setting up the way that Moyes has set up West Ham. Another player I kind of want to talk on that is Paquetá. Is a phenomenal midfielder, and I really think, and he would be at Manchester City right now, if it weren't for some gambling allegations, I think they're prepared to spend about 80 million on him. And basically, if City is looking at a player, more often than not, they're probably pretty good and worth whatever the value that they're about to spend on him. But there were some gambling allegations that came out that he was actually betting on games that he was playing in. I actually don't know where those have gone, if they've been kind of unfounded or what's happened, but they seemed like at the time at the start of the season, they had a lot of smoke from what was coming from there.
Yeah, and he's a good player, and he's, like you said, he's the type of player I think that West Ham generally wouldn't kind of have access to. He reminds me of Dimitri Payet, who played for West Ham about, maybe 8 to 10 years ago, and who was kind of their talisman and kind of a technical attacking player that really was able to lead the team from a creative attacking aspect. But I think we'd be really remiss if we didn't comment on Jared Bowen, who's probably their best player at this moment. It's interesting because he's in the prime of his career. He's 27 years old. There was some thought that he would go to Liverpool at some point. He's always been a really good kind of Premier League winger, but he's taken the next step. So he's scored double-digit goals now for West Ham, is leading them as their leading goal scorer, and he's kind of taken up a role as a striker, and he's been at the club for a long time. The fans love him. It looks like, now that he's 27, it's possible that he moves on, but he's not unlike Declan Rice. He's not quite destined for the very, very top. So hopefully he's somebody that will be, and he's a little bit older. So hopefully he's somebody that will be at West Ham for the rest of his career, essentially. And he's really taken off and become one of the better players in the Premier League. And, somebody that's really turned games around for West Ham. And if they're going to go far in Europa League this year, I think he's going to be critical to that. Mohamed Kudus as well came from Ajax. And there's also thought that, he would end up on a team like Manchester United or other teams. And he's somebody that, probably views West Ham a little bit more as a stepping stone, but he's also scored double-digit goals. So the combination of Paquetá, Jared Bowen, and Kudus as an attacking group, I think has made West Ham scary because those players are all just so devastating on the counterattack, whereas you can still kind of have that classic David Moyes solidity, but they have attacking players of a quality that they generally West Ham doesn't get. So, I think it's an exciting time to be a West Ham fan. I think the biggest complaint would be, you'd want them to play a little bit more expansive, open, attacking football, but I think right now it's going to be hard for them to do that with this manager in charge. David Moyes is starting to take on the fans a little bit, which he's always done that a little bit, I think. But basically, he's asking the fans like, who would you get that's better than me? And other managers. Yeah, I think he basically just said in a recent interview that other managers can play football, but I'm here to win football matches. And he's not wrong. He's won them a trophy and had decent league positions with them. It's one to keep your eye out for whether or not the people above him think that he's the right kind of guy to go forward. So at the end of the day, West Ham started off looking like they were, halfway through the season, it looked like they might push for those European spots. They've really fallen off in the league recently. I think they've had a few losses back to back. And you'd think that maybe they would switch their focus now to Europe and see, we won Europa Conference League last year. Maybe we can push it and win Europa League this year, and that would move them up into the Champions League, which would be just so incredible for the reputation of West Ham and also for the finances if they were able to win the Europa League.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent summary of probably the frustrations a lot of fans have. I mean, as I was listening to you rattle off those names, I was like, man, you're right. This is a team that is primed and could play some really, really beautiful, interesting to watch soccer. And instead, they're kind of sitting there playing some counterattacking style. But I mean, that actually probably helps them in Europe, right? I think one of the problems that English teams especially have is they go out into European competitions and try to play their normal game. They try to go out there and play it like they're playing a league game, when some of these other teams are happy to win the football game. I think a perfect example was I don't know if anybody here is watching the Champions League game between Arsenal and Porto, but I think the ball was in play. I think it was like 52% of the time. So half of the actual game time, the ball was in play. It was the worst thing to watch. It was anti-football. It was anti-everything, but Porto ends up winning. So I think Moises' quote's very interesting, kind of funny, especially if you're a neutral. I'm here to win. I'm not here to play games.
Yeah, and the Champions League, just like you said, is incredibly different soccer than the Premier League. The Champions League is probably closer to what you would expect for like international World Cup games, where it's very cagey, very edgy. Nobody wants to give up a goal, and the dark arts are like completely acceptable, right? Because you only have to win one game or two, draw one game, win another game, and you're through to the knockout rounds. Doesn't matter how many shots they pelted your goal with, as long as you just had one, decent shot or got one penalty called for you. So these teams, you hate to say generally, but it's often in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, and often in times in England too, depending on who's managing the team in England. I'm not going to say that the English teams don't dive and do the fouls and dark arts and all that stuff, because they do it very well as well. But these other teams, I think, view it more as a art and as a skill and something to kind of be admired and worthy. The proof is in the pudding. If you win the games, nobody really remembers how you won them. After a couple months. So it's a different kind of soccer. It's one that you have to be prepared for. It's one that Arsenal has traditionally not done well with handling, even when they're doing decently in the league. Arsenal's never really been a good team in Europe, whereas Liverpool has always been able to handle that. Whether or not Liverpool is doing well in the league, they tend to be really good in Europe. So, there is something, I think, to that in terms of how different clubs kind of have a style and whether they're able to adapt that to playing in Europe. But it seems like David Moyes, who traditionally hasn't done great in Europe, has done decently well in Europa Conference League last year. And, let's see if they can kind of make another move and do well in Europa League, which is a much harder competition than Europa Conference League, with serious teams, a lot of which were in the Champions League, and including teams like Liverpool, right? Like these are serious teams that you have to beat to win the Europa League.
Speaking of like Conference League, if you want a little look into West Ham, I think there was a crazy video last year. I think it was an away day against AZ, which is Dutch team. West Ham, I think, ended up winning the game, and a bad side of Dutch football is there's a lot of ultras that are still out and about. You can see videos of it online. They still have some fans that take things way too far, are, in my personal opinion, not really true fans. They're just there looking for fights. Yeah, it's more or less what they're using football as an outlet to fight rather than for the game itself. But I think last year at the away game, basically the stadium attendance lost control of what was going on. And every time you play a game, the away team gets a section that is kind of cordoned off just for them, just for their fans. And it looks like the stadium security kind of lost control, and the AZ Ultras were trying to storm the West Ham fan section, where a lot of the players' families were sitting, where just away fans are kind of huddled in these stands. And these two massive, and I mean massive, in not just the West Ham,
That's why they're West Ham fans.
just these massive English lads were more or less
And they're not even lads. They're old lads. They were lads 20 years ago.
standing in more or less the horn gates of 300, just instead of the six packs, put together like a six pack of kegs. These just giant beer guts. These two guys are shirtless, just punching off these AZ ultras that are trying to climb and get after and cause havoc in the away fans. These two guys are more or less just takes off their belts at one point and are just whipping these guys who are trying to climb up this tiny stairwell. It was absolutely iconic. You should go look at the YouTube.
Legendary moment for England. Heroic stuff. And if we were English, it'd make you proud to be English. Those are the guys that that's what you picture when you think of a guy attending a soccer match. And those guys, I think they did West Ham proud, and I think they probably got a couple pints on the way home if I were a betting man.
Yeah, that's what Brexit's all about, right? Being able to fight
Exactly. Brexit means Brexit.
being able to fight the continent on their soil. But iconic video. Look it up if you're so inclined on YouTube. And good story, because West Ham ends up winning the whole Conference League anyway. So there's really no place for that kind of violence from those AZ fans.
Yeah, and just to touch on a couple more players that I think are really interesting for West Ham, their midfield is they've put together an interesting list. Edson Alvarez, kind of as a defensive midfielder from Ajax, I think has started to solidify himself as an important piece. They've signed Calvin Phillips, who I think has had a bad start to his career at West Ham, and he was a player that was kind of making the England team. He was a defensive midfielder for Marcelo Bielsa and Leeds United. Manchester City bought him. He's probably Manchester City's only bad signing in the last decade, and he kind of had a complete failure at Manchester City. And Pep calling him overweight, and Pep recently apologized for that. I mean, at the end of the day, Calvin Phillips said he was overweight, so it's I understand your manager shouldn't throw you under the bus, but you also are a professional player and probably shouldn't be overweight. So either way, he has moved to West Ham to try to revitalize his career. He's still relatively young, but he's kind of had a bad start, made some high-profile errors that have led to some goals being conceded. So we'll see if he can kind of turn it around. I think that would be a huge step for them because he obviously has a lot of talent and is somebody that could go really far. In the midfield, you did mention James Ward-Prowse. They also have Thomas Souček, who I really like. He's really a throwback kind of. He's almost like a Scott McTominay type, where he's a big midfielder who really is his main calling card is getting up front and scoring goals, often with his head. He just has a nose for the goal. I think in his first season, he came from a small team, I believe, from Czech Republic, and he scored, I think, 10 goals or something in the Premier League. So he's made a difference. He brings a real physical presence to that team and to their attacking set pieces that, in combination with James Ward-Prowse, really makes them dangerous. And those set pieces are really important in competitions like Europe when games are settled by only a goal or two apiece. And a lot of times they're cagey with the other team, not letting you kind of play soccer. Having that threat on set pieces is huge. In defense, Kurt Zouma is probably their anchor there. He's been a player that used to play for Chelsea and is kind of in the prime of his career now, whereas he is kind of a rock at center back and is somebody that I think anchors that team and gives them kind of a focal point from the back. So, this is a team I think that is in its prime. I don't think it's like a team full of young players or youth players, but it's a team I think that right now is its moment to kind of, for this cycle of West Ham players to kind of push itself to see how high it can go. And this season, I think really the aim is going to be Europe, and that can end so poorly because it's easy to get knocked out. But if they are able to kind of climb that mountain, it's just going to be up and up and up for the Hammers.
Yeah, I respect it. I really do. I say go for it. See how high you can go, and you might be rewarded like they were last year. I think in my mind, I don't know if this is super fair, and I will say I probably haven't thought about this too much, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think West Ham right now is a better run Everton, right? I think they're kind of in that next tier. They're definitely not the biggest team in their respective cities, but they, this would be what Everton could be like if they actually made good signings and, went for a stadium deal rather than, trying to make bad signings and also try to build a new stadium at the same time.
Yeah, and let's do our famous hope to heartbreak scale. So I'm going to give you a second to think about it. This is something I think that can be challenging for these teams that are a little bit lower down the league, where the expectation is maybe not to win the league, or at least not in the short term win the league. Obviously you can hope for a Leicester type season, but when you look at hope to heartbreak, a lot of that is going to be based on expectation. So what do you think, if you were a West Ham fan, or if someone were to get into West Ham now, what their hope to heartbreak scale is going to be going forward?
Yeah, so I think right now I'm going to go with the hope being about a 3.5 out of 5. I think the hope is there because obviously they found some success last year. They have an absolutely exciting team with some really, really talented players, even after losing their kind of talisman as Declan Rice. So I think a 3.5 is going to be kind of my hope. What do you have on hope?
I'm probably closer to 2, to be honest, because I do think that their future is limited with David Moyes. I think this would be, after the season, would be a good time to move on from him because he gives you what you're going to get. But I think the fans have been happy with that for the last 5 years or so, but they are kind of getting restless. And I think if you're somebody that wants to see West Ham grow and grow and grow, and then you might have to take a chance with an up and coming manager. And a team like West Ham, back 20 years ago, it would have been really hard to attract a top level manager from Spain or Germany. Now it's far, far easier because West Ham has so much money. They can pay those managers really well. And every manager pretty much wants to end up in the Premier League. So they can take somebody that is a really good manager in Germany or Spain and bring them to the club. And and try to rework the way that they do transfers, because those of their transfer, you say they're a better version of Everton. I kind of just think they're Everton who happened to get sell Declan Rice for 100 million. And the fact that they both had David Moyes for a long time, I think, I don't think these are particularly well-run clubs. I don't think they are very innovative in the transfer market. They're kind of they're a little bit of dinosaurs, to be honest. And I think a revamp in terms of the club ethos would be a welcome thing. But I'm not sure that they're going to do that, because that's just not how West Ham has worked under this ownership. So for me, the hope is two. If I'm going to go heartbreak, true heartbreak, I think is going to be 3.5 maybe, because I think the heartbreak exists in the fact that if they don't turn this period into kind of another platform from which to take another leap, I think it's going to hurt, right? Because they're going to kind of fall back down into that kind of lower middle class of the Premier League, where they're still thinking about relegation every year. So they have set themselves up on a platform. I think it's going to be really hard for them to jump into those upper echelons, but what they really are going to want to do is solidify themselves as a club that is in London, plays in a big stadium, has some pull, recently won some trophies, and has some good players that they can kind of build this club into something bigger and better every year. So I don't think super highly of the team that runs this club and the ownership group. So I think the chances of them not doing that are pretty high. But I think this is still a really fun club to get involved with, and a lot of history. It's a team that doesn't, it being in London, I think is always appealing to kind of foreign fans as well. It makes it a lot easier for you to kind of go visit them and see them play. And it's a team, I think, that has a great history and has really great fans. If I'm being honest, they have a lot of rivalries with all the London clubs. Tottenham is probably their biggest, but they kind of don't like Chelsea, Tottenham, Arsenal. These are all of the London rivalries, I think, are really fun, because there's just so many good London teams in the Premier League. And West Ham has always had a really great support, massive support, if you will. And I think it's a fun team to get behind.
Yeah, I think 3.5 is exactly what I have for the heartbreak as well. Uh, I do think these kind of teams, these kind of moments, these kind of players all coming together don't happen every day for, especially this tier of team and club. So if you don't capitalize on it, there's always this what if, right? This what if we only would have had this manager, or if only would have done this, or if we only would have invested more. And you look back at these times and you say, like, man, we could have done more. So, I mean, that's not to say that they haven't already won a European competition. So that's already a huge milestone. They could look back in this period and still have their heads held high. But I do know, as a fan, you do look back at certain teams and say, if we just would have splashed a little bit more money or changed the manager, what could have been? So I think 3.5 is very fair, and it's kind of what I have as the heartbreak as well. All right, I think that is going to do it for this episode of Premier League Proven. As always, thank you all so much for listening to us. Please let us know if you have any other episodes or teams or topics that you kind of want us to cover. We are happy to take those suggestions and kind of put out some of that content for you.
Thank you for listening, and that's us signing off.